It was early morning, the sun still hiding behind the tall buildings, and the streets were just beginning to wake up. Outside the grand gates of a huge mansion, a man sat on the cold pavement. His clothes were old and full of dust, his shoes were almost torn, and his hair looked like it had not seen a comb in days. People passing by slowed down to look at him. Some whispered to each other, wondering where he had come from. Others simply frowned and walked away, shaking their heads. It was a strange sight because the mansion behind him was the biggest house in the area. It had tall white walls, shining windows, and a garden so perfect it looked like something out of a movie. Expensive cars were parked inside, the kind most people only dream about owning. And yet, here was a beggar, sitting right outside as if he belonged nowhere else. The man kept his head down most of the time. He had a small bag beside him, the kind you see with people who have traveled too far, with no place left to go. From time to time, he looked up at the mansion gate, as if waiting for someone to come out. But nobody paid attention. The security guards glanced at him a few times, but didn't chase him away. Maybe they felt a little pity. Maybe they didn't want to make a scene in front of the neighbors. What no one knew, what no one could have even guessed, was that this so-called beggar was not a poor man at all. He was the owner of the mansion itself. Yes, the very same man people saw driving expensive cars, attending grand parties, and signing big deals in the city. Today he was sitting on the pavement, like someone who had lost everything. He had taken old clothes from the storage room, rubbed dust on his face and hands, and walked out of his own house before sunrise so nobody would recognize him. Why would a man with so much money, so much power, choose to sit outside his own mansion looking like he had nothing? The reason was simple, but something only he understood. For a long time, he had wondered about the people around him, the neighbors, the workers, even strangers on the street. Did they treat him with respect because of the person he was? Or only because of his wealth? Did anyone have real kindness left in their hearts? Or had money blinded everyone? There was only one way to find out, and so he became a beggar for a day. As he sat there, cars passed by. People going for their morning walk stared. Some looked at him with disgust, some with pity, and a few with irritation, as if his very presence was ruining the beauty of the neighborhood. "Why is he sitting here?" one man said loudly to his friend. "Someone like this should go to a shelter, not sit in front of decent homes." The man in old clothes heard everything. He stayed quiet. A woman walking her dog crossed the road to avoid him. A group of kids pointed and laughed before their mother pulled them away. Even the street vendors selling tea and snacks nearby kept their distance, afraid he might ask for food without money. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher. His back hurt from sitting so long. His stomach growled, but he didn't move. This was part of his test. He wanted to see who would stop. Who would speak? Who would care? Inside the mansion, some workers noticed him too. The gardener muttered that such people were everywhere these days. The driver laughed and said rich folk should complain to the police. None of them knew that the man outside was their own employer, watching them closely, learning more about them in a few hours than he had in years. But not everyone was cruel. A few kind souls dropped a coin or two in front of him without saying a word. An old man walking by gave him a small bottle of water. A delivery boy left a half-eaten sandwich near his bag. Still, most people passed without a glance. As the day slowly moved on, the man realized something important. Money changes how people see you. When he was in his suit, driving his luxury car, the world smiled at him, opened doors for him, treated him like a king. But now, dressed in rags, he was invisible to most and a burden to some. And yet, he was waiting for one thing, one true act of kindness, one person who would talk to him like he was human, not a problem to be ignored. He didn't know it yet, but before the day ended, someone was about to change everything. The sun was now high in the sky, and the heat pressed down on the pavement like a heavy blanket. The man sitting outside the mansion wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. His old shirt clung to him, dusty and damp, but he stayed where he was. This was part of his plan. He had promised himself he would not leave until the day revealed the truth he was looking for. More people began passing by as the street grew busier. Some were heading to work, dressed in neat clothes and polished shoes. Others were neighbors, taking their kids to school or going shopping. And each time someone walked past, the man noticed their faces, their eyes, their small reactions to his presence. A few people slowed down to stare. Some whispered to each other, thinking he couldn't hear them. One man shook his head and said loudly to no one in particular, "This is what happens when you don't work hard in life." The words stung, even though the man knew they weren't true. He had worked harder than anyone could imagine to build his wealth. But sitting there in those clothes, with dust on his face, he realized how quickly people judge when they think you have nothing. Two teenage boys rode by on bicycles, laughing as they pointed at him. "Look at this guy," one of them said, "sitting in front of a palace like he owns it." If only they knew, a woman walked by carrying shopping bags. She gave him one long cold look, then crossed the street to avoid him, clutching her purse as if he might get up and steal it. The man said nothing. He didn't beg. He didn't ask for money or food. He simply sat there, silently, watching the world show its true face. He noticed something else too. The workers from his own mansion, people who had been around him for years, were beginning to gather near the gate, talking among themselves. The gardener leaned on his shovel and muttered, "He's been here since morning. Someone should call the police before he causes trouble." The driver laughed. "Look at his clothes. Probably some drunk who lost everything." One of the guards shrugged. "Let him be. He's not harming anyone." They all looked at him like he was a stranger, like he didn't belong near the walls of the grand house behind him. Not one of them recognized their own boss sitting right there, in the dust, and that was exactly what he wanted, because this was the test. He wanted to see how people treated someone they believed had nothing to offer them. As the day dragged on, more people spoke, some out loud, some in whispers. He heard words like lazy, useless, waste of space. One man even shouted at him to get a job before walking away laughing. But there were small moments of humanity too. Little boy walking by with his father tried to hand him a cookie. The father quickly pulled the child away, scolding him for getting too close. The man in the old clothes gave the boy a small smile anyway, grateful for the innocent kindness children often had before the world taught them to look away. A delivery man on a motorbike stopped at the mansion gate, dropped off a package, and as he rode away, he slipped a bottle of water near the man's bag without saying a word. Then he was gone as quickly as he came, but most people just passed by without a second glance. Inside his heart, the man felt a heavy weight growing. He had built schools, donated to hospitals, given jobs to dozens of people in this very neighborhood. But today, without his wealth showing, without the fine clothes or the cars, he was just another beggar in their eyes, and that told him everything he needed to know. As the sun began to lower and shadows stretched across the pavement, he realized something else too. He had been waiting for hours, and in all this time, not one person had asked if he was okay. Not one person had stopped to talk to him like he was human. Until now. A young woman walking by slowed her steps when she saw him. She looked at him differently, not with disgust, not with fear, but with something he hadn't seen all day, concern. She held a small bag in her hand, and after a moment's hesitation, she walked toward him. "Sir," she said softly, kneeling, so she could look him in the eye, "have you eaten anything today?" The man stared at her, surprised. She opened the bag and pulled out a simple meal, a sandwich, a bottle of water, and a small packet of biscuits. "Please take this," she said. "It's not much, but it's fresh." For the first time day, the man felt his chest tighten, not from judgment or anger, but from the unexpected warmth of a stranger's kindness. He took the food slowly, nodding his thanks, his voice quiet. "Thank you." She smiled, not knowing she was speaking to one of the wealthiest men in the city. To her, he was just a hungry man sitting alone on the street. And in that moment, she had no idea her small act of kindness was about to change everything. The man sat there quietly, holding the sandwich and the bottle of water the young woman had given him. He hadn't eaten all day. It wasn't because he had no money. He had more than enough wealth to buy a 5-star meal anytime he wanted. But this test wasn't about food. It was about people. About kindness. About seeing the world through the eyes of someone who had nothing. And so far, the world had failed. All day, he had been ignored, judged, mocked, and pushed aside. People looked at him as if he were invisible, or worse, as if he were in the way. Some dropped coins, yes, but even that felt more like charity to make themselves feel better than any real concern for him. But this young woman, she was different. She didn't throw money at him and walk away. She didn't talk down to him like he was some helpless creature. She came close, spoke softly, and looked at him like he was a human being, not a problem to be avoided. "Please eat before it gets cold," she said, gently. The man nodded and slowly unwrapped the sandwich. It was simple, just bread, some cheese, and vegetables, but to him, it felt like the most meaningful meal he had eaten in a long time. Not because of the taste, but because of what it meant. As he ate, the young woman sat on the edge of the pavement beside him, as if she wasn't in a hurry to leave. People passing by stared, some shaking their heads in disbelief. A few even whispered things like, "Why is she talking to that beggar?" But she didn't seem to care. After a moment, she asked softly, "Do you live around here?" The man smiled faintly. "You could say that," he replied, his voice quiet, almost amused at the irony of his words. She didn't ask him for his story. She didn't demand to know why he was sitting there or what mistakes had led him to this point. She simply offered him a listening ear if he wanted to talk. "My mother always says," she told him, "you should never ignore someone just because they look poor. You never know what they've been through." The man nodded slowly, feeling her words sink deep into his heart. For hours he had been treated like dirt, as if his worth had vanished with his clean clothes and fancy car. But now, sitting on the ground with this stranger who showed him respect without even knowing who he was, it felt like a warmth he hadn't realized he needed. He looked at her carefully. She was young, maybe in her 20s, dressed simply, carrying a cloth bag that looked like she had just returned from the market. There was nothing rich or flashy about her. She wasn't doing this to show off or to impress anyone. She was kind because kindness was simply who she was, and that touched him more than he could express. "You shouldn't sit here in the heat," she said after a while. "There's a shelter down the road. They give food and water. You can rest there." The man nodded but didn't move. He had no plans to leave yet. Not until the day was over. Not until the test was complete. She looked at him for a moment, as if sensing there was something more to him than what met the eye. But she didn't press him with questions. Before she left, she handed him a few more biscuits and said, "Take care of yourself, okay?" The man watched her walk away, disappearing into the crowd. He felt something shift inside him. The neighbors who mocked him, the workers who laughed, the strangers who judged, they had shown him one side of humanity. But this young woman had shown him another. And now, a new thought began forming in his mind. This wasn't just a test anymore. It was a lesson about how wealth often hides the truth. When people see your riches, they treat you with respect, with kindness, with fake smiles. But take that away, and you see who they really are. He looked at the sandwich wrapper beside him, the empty bottle of water, the small packet of biscuits she had given him. One simple act of kindness. That was all it took to remind him that goodness still existed in the world. As the sun began to set, he made a decision. Tomorrow, things would be different. Tomorrow, the world would see who the beggar outside the mansion really was. And for some people, it was going to be a day they would never forget. The next morning, the neighborhood was buzzing with curiosity. The beggar, who had sat outside the mansion all day yesterday, had not returned. People wondered if the guards had finally thrown him out or if he had simply gone somewhere else. But before anyone could get answers, something unexpected happened. Just after sunrise, the giant gates of the mansion swung open. A line of shiny black cars rolled out slowly, the kind that made everyone stop and stare. The cars parked neatly along the street, and out stepped men in crisp suits, each carrying folders, cameras, or microphones. Then the last car door opened, and the beggar from yesterday stepped out. Only, he didn't look like a beggar anymore. He was wearing a perfectly tailored suit, shoes that gleamed in the morning light, and a watch so expensive it could pay for half the houses in the neighborhood. His hair was neatly combed, his face freshly shaved, and as he adjusted his tie and looked around, the people on the street froze, because now they recognized him. The man who had been sitting in the dust outside the mansion yesterday was the owner of the mansion himself. Gasps went up in the crowd. Some people even stepped back, shocked. The gardener who had complained about him yesterday dropped his rake. The driver who had laughed at him stood with his mouth open. Neighbors who had mocked him were whispering to each other in panic. It was as if the entire street had turned to stone. The wealthy man stood tall, looking around slowly, letting the silence sink in. His eyes moved from the guards at the gate to the neighbors across the road, to the people who had passed him without a glance yesterday. He could see the shame on their faces now. The man cleared his throat, and his voice was calm but carried a weight that made everyone listen. Yesterday, he began, I sat here for hours, dressed in old clothes, looking like I had nothing. And I watched. People shifted uncomfortably. I watched how strangers reacted to me. I watched how neighbors spoke about me. I even watched how my own staff looked at me. And I learned something important. No one said a word. The wealthy man paused and let his words hang in the air. I learned, he said slowly, that respect should not depend on what a person wears, or how much money they have, or where they live. Some people lowered their eyes. Others looked like they wished the ground would open up and swallow them. Many of you, he continued, his eyes sweeping over the crowd, mocked me, laughed at me, judged me without knowing who I was. Some even told me to leave. The guards and workers looked at each other nervously. But one person, he said, his voice softening, showed me kindness. The young woman who had given him food yesterday stood in the crowd, her eyes wide. She had no idea this was coming. She didn't know who I was, the man said, looking at her. She didn't care if I had money or not. She only cared that I looked hungry. And that, he added, his voice rising slightly, is the kind of humanity the world needs more of. Everyone turned to look at the young woman now. She looked embarrassed but also proud in a quiet way. The man smiled at her. Yesterday, you reminded me that kindness still exists. And for that, I thank you. The wealthy man then turned to face the others, the workers who had mocked him, the neighbors who had crossed the street to avoid him. I have lived in this mansion for years, he said. But yesterday, sitting on the ground, I learned more about people than I have in a lifetime. There was silence again. Heavy, uncomfortable silence. Some of the staff looked like they wanted to apologize. The neighbors shifted nervously, realizing how badly they had failed the test. But the man wasn't done yet. He raised a hand toward the young woman, who had helped him. Because of your kindness, he said to her, I want to do something for you, something meaningful. The crowd watched as he asked one of his assistants to bring forward a folder. He opened it, signed a few papers, and handed it to her. This, he said, is a scholarship for your studies, and a fund to help your family. You didn't ask for anything, but kindness like yours should never go unnoticed. The young woman stood there, speechless, tears forming in her eyes. As for the rest of the crowd, the wealthy man didn't punish them. He didn't fire his workers or shout at the neighbors. He simply said, "How you treat people who have nothing shows the kind of person you really are. Remember that." And with that, he turned and walked back into his mansion, leaving the entire street silent and shaken. For a long moment after the wealthy man disappeared into his mansion, the street remained completely silent. The neighbors who had mocked him the day before stood frozen. The workers who had laughed nervously avoided each other's eyes. Even the guards at the gate shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what to say. They had all seen something they would never forget. A man who owned everything, sitting in the dust like he had nothing. And the truth it revealed about people's hearts. Young woman who had offered him food the day before still held the folder he had given her. Inside were documents promising a scholarship for her studies and financial support for her family. Her hands trembled as she looked down at it. She had not helped him expecting anything in return. In fact, when she had offered him that sandwich and bottle of water, she had assumed he was just another stranger in need. Now she realized he was the owner of the mansion, one of the richest men in the city, and he had chosen to reward her kindness. In a way she could never have imagined. People began murmuring among themselves. Some said they felt guilty for judging him so quickly. Others admitted they had avoided even looking at him because they assumed he was just another beggar. One of the mansion workers whispered to another, "I can't believe that was him. We've been working for him for years. And we didn't even recognize him." The driver, who had laughed at the man yesterday, stared at the ground. The gardener, who had complained about him, picked up his tools quietly, his face red with shame, but the wealthy man had not scolded anyone. He had not raised his voice or punished them. Instead, he had left them with something far heavier than anger. He had left them with the weight of their own actions. Inside the mansion, the wealthy man sat in his study, looking out at the same street where he had sat in the dust the day before. He thought about everything he had seen, the looks of disgust, the whispers, the judgment, and then the one act of kindness that had changed everything. It wasn't the money. It wasn't the mansion. It wasn't the cars or the power. It was the simple fact that a stranger had treated him like a human being when no one else did. That was what stayed with him. That was what mattered. News of what happened spread quickly through the neighborhood. By evening, people were still talking about it. Some said they would never look at another homeless person the same way again. Others admitted the day had opened their eyes to how easily they judged people based on appearances. The young woman, now sitting at home with her family, told them everything. How she had only wanted to help someone in need. How the man had turned out to be one of the wealthiest people in the city. How he had rewarded her kindness with opportunities that would change her life forever. Her mother listened with tears. In her eyes, "Kindness always finds its way back," she said softly. Always. The next day, the wealthy man's words were printed in a local newspaper. A journalist who had been present wrote about how he disguised himself as a beggar to test the people around him, how most had failed the test, and how one woman's kindness had stood out like a single candle in the dark. People across the city read the story and began asking themselves the same question. How would I have treated him if I were there? The lesson was simple, yet powerful. Respect should never depend on someone's clothes, or their money, or their status. True character shows in how you treat those who can do nothing for you in return. As for the wealthy man, he went back to his life as usual. The mansion gates stayed open, the cars came and went, and business meetings filled his days. But deep inside, something had changed for him. Because now he knew the truth about the people around him. He knew who had looked at him with kindness, and who had looked at him with contempt. And that knowledge was worth more than all the riches he owned. For the young woman, life began to change in ways she could not have imagined. The scholarship allowed her to finish her studies. The financial help eased her family struggles. But what she valued most was not the money, it was the lesson she carried with her. For the rest of her life, one small act of kindness can change everything. As weeks passed, people in the neighborhood often spoke about the day the wealthy man disguised himself as a beggar. They said it opened their eyes. They said it made them think twice before judging anyone again. And perhaps in some quiet, unseen way, it made the world just a little bit kinder, because sometimes all it takes is one man sitting in the dust to show everyone what humanity really means.